Three Birds Free by Dennis M. Morrison. In the beginning. If I live to be 100 years old, I will never forget that summer, and at age 75 I just might make it. As I sit here on my veranda looking over Lake Huron, it all seems as vivid and real, well, just like it happened only a week ago. The sun is just above the horizon as I write this account. The sunrise is spectacular and always amazes me with its many shades of orange. A few dark clouds are silhouetted to the north like so many ships sailing across a great ethereal sea. The morning had been very much like this on, well, it was June 18th, 1887. I was 10 years old then, and my dad Hudson Ranger and my brother Bernie, who was 12 years old, and oh yeah, my name is Joseph, or Joey as they used to call me back then. Well, us three were going to take a trip. Since the late fall of 1886, we had planned on taking Dad's sailing boat out on Lake Huron for a whole month. We were going to leave Mama and my sister Tesha in charge of our mercantile store. Dad planned our route to take us from Saginaw Bay on up past Mackinac Island and then on to Sault Ste. Marie. But then some things that were downright strange began to happen to us. Let me tell you the entire story from the get-go. I think you'll find it interesting and hopefully a little exciting. Chapter 1. Three Birds Set Sail on Lake Huron. Mama was kind of ticked at Dad that day as we drove the buckboard down to the dock. It was Sunday, and our store, the Ranger Mercantile, was closed. Bernie, Tesha, and I sat in the back with a load of supplies for the trip. We bounced up and down over the bumps in the road, and I just knew getting seasick couldn't be any worse than how my stomach felt right then. Mama did not try to hide her displeasure with Dad. "Hudson, I never thought this day would come. All your planning with the boys. Well, I thought you'd come to your senses before this day ever arrived." "Come now, Nora," Dad said with a deep sigh. "Must we hash this all out again and in front of the children?" She shot him a sharp glance from those brilliant green eyes of hers. Everyone thought Mama's eyes were beautiful like two fine emeralds. She said, "Hudson, you know I don't care if you take this trip. You deserve it. You're a hard worker. And Bernie, well, he's old enough to too, I guess. But why must you take Joey? He's just not old enough to be gone on the lake for so long." Papa gave Mama one of his kindest smiles, a smile that all the ladies who came into the store loved, a smile which could win over the most cussed ornery person alive. "Nora, he's my son, and I want to do this with both my sons. He isn't a baby, and you have to cut him loose some. He'll be fine, and he'll come home a lot more strong. You'll see." I smiled inside. I was happy my dad wanted me with him. In fact, nothing could have made me feel better inside. I'd always been kind of a small boy, and that caused me a lot of trouble with the older kids. I was tired of Bernie having to fight my fights for me. If I was going to come back stronger, I was all for that. Besides, I didn't know anyone in all Harbor Port whose dad was going to take them on such an exciting journey for the summer. I was lucky, all right, and I sure knew it. "But why did you have to choose a Sunday to leave on, Hudson?" Mama lamented. It's our day of rest. Do you really expect the Lord to bless such an adventure that begins on His holy day? We were within sight of the lake now, and the sun reflected like diamonds off the ripples on the water. "Well, I sure do, Nora," he replied. "Isn't that what the boys and I are after? A little rest?" She smiled back at him, and I could tell that Dad had won the argument. "I could never win a sparring match against you, you old codger." Mama snuggled over close to Dad, and Tesha smiled. Dad said, "I'm not an old codger. I'm only 40. Mama giggled, and then Dad said to her, "You don't need to worry, Nora. I'd never let anything happen to the children." She patted his hand. "I know you wouldn't, but no matter what you say, Hudson, I'll worry about them, and you. My three birds sailing out on Lake Huron alone. My three birds free." Dad just smiled, and for the next half hour him and Mama were just sort of quiet. It was a wonderful morning. The sweet smell of pine and cedar hung in the air as it wafted in from Kramer's lumber mill. Tesha looked over at Bernie and me. I could just tell what she was thinking before she even said a word on account of she had this faraway look in her eyes. "Bernie, Joey, what am I going to do with you both gone for so long? I'm going to miss you both something terrible." Then before I could move out of her way, she threw her arms around me, hugged me, and then, abomination of abominations, she went and kissed me right on my forehead. I pulled back and wiped that kiss right off. "Aw, sis, why'd you have to go and do that?" Bernie started laughing at me because he knew how much I hated to be kissed by any girl, even my sister. "I'll miss you too, but you don't see me slobbering all over your face, do you?" I felt bad for saying that because it looked like her feelings were kind of hurt. But gosh, that stuff sort of embarrassed me to no end. "I'm sorry," she said, and then started moping and moved away from us boys. She just sat there awful quiet until we reached the dock. Glory, but all the seagulls were singing loud and clear as they circled in the sky that day. It was like they was welcoming us and letting us know that we were headed for calm waters. When Dad stopped the buckboard, Bernie, Tesha, and me jumped out. Dad said to us, "Now, you three unload the rest of those supplies and get them on the boat. I need to talk to your mom a bit more." Talking? Ha! I knew what he wanted, a few moments alone with Mama to give her a few more kisses and tell her everything would be all right and that he'd miss her and that all the other sickening stuff that grown-ups tell each other. Sure as all, I turned around and looked, and Dad was kissing her again and had his arms around her. I looked at Bernie and Tesha and said, "Now ain't that just a sick display? Why do grown-ups act so stupid?" Bernie gave Tesha a wink and said to me, "Because they love each other, and if you're grown up and love each other, well, that's how you do." I just shook my head. "Well, it's plain stupid if you ask me. They ought to just shake hands." Tesha gave me one of those sharp looks she had learned so well from Mama and then said, "Joey, quit acting like a brat. Another few years and you'll be looking for a special girl to be kissing on." Bernie laughed real hard at that. "Yeah, Joey, then you'll know what kissing's all about." "Like you would know," I shot back. "I've been kissed a few times," he began bragging. "By what?" I asked. "Shawnee Miller's old hound dog? Who else would want to kiss someone as ugly as you, as all-fired ugly as you are?" Then it was Tesha's turn to laugh. "I saw him kissing Corey Taylor out back of the school last week," and at that, Bernie's face turned as red as an old beet. I looked again, and Dad was still acting all lovey with Mama, so I called out, "All aboard that's going aboard. Come on, Dad." Dad turned, and then at last he and Mama came strolling over to the boat. He kissed her again, and then came on board. "Now, Bernie," Mama began, "you help your dad. Watch out for Joey. I love you all, and I'll pray for your safe trip." Bernie and me went down and hugged Mama and Tesha. We got back on board and then cast off the lines and set the sails. It wasn't but a moment, and Dad was taking us away from the dock and out onto the smooth, calm bay. I watched a long time as Mama and Tesha grew smaller and smaller. Then I could barely make them out as they got back onto the buckboard and started for home. But us three, well, we were on our grand adventure. The lake that morning was very calm, and the warm sun felt so good as it bore down on us. Our pace was slow, and Dad seemed impatient for more of a breeze to fill our sails. After all, we had a long voyage ahead of us, and we were anxious to be well on our way. I wanted to put a line over and fish, but Bernie and Dad said it would do no good on mornings such as this. Dad said on these calm days, the fish just go deep and try to rest. He said they get lazy. I laid down on the foredeck, and it got so warm that I stripped off my shirt and my shoes and socks. The warm breeze felt so good as it blew across my bare skin, and I could feel the sun already starting to tan my hide. Our first portage wasn't all that far off, about 4 or 5 hour jaunt. We were going to land and spend the night on Big Charity Island. I was pretty excited about that because I've never been on an island before. I'd always wanted to since reading about that old Robinson Crusoe. Now there was a guy who really had some adventures. About noon, I went below with Bernie and started getting lunch ready. I wasn't too hungry because my stomach was sort of skittish, what with not being used to the rocking of the boat. Bernie said that would pass before long. We three all ate topside. By the time we had finished, the wind had picked up and we were making pretty good time. Dad seemed pleased with that. To the northwest we could hear thunder, but there weren't any clouds in the sky. Sometimes it was pretty loud, too. Bernie said, "Ain't that kind of queer to hear thunder like that, Dad, and not see any clouds?" Dad scratched his head and said, "Well, I guess so. Can't recall it ever happening before. Probably a storm off to the west. We'll likely see the clouds before long. Another couple hours and we'll be making camp on the island. Then it doesn't matter how bad we get a storm." "It matters, Dad. It matters," I said. "What do you mean, Joey?" Dad asked. "Well, I've been doing some reading on the Indians of the lakes area and what they believe in." "So what?" Bernie asked sarcastically. "Who cares what a bunch of old Indians think anyways?" "Don't brush off lightly what the Indians believe in, Bernie," Dad said. "They are wise in a great many things. Now, Joey, tell us what you read." Well, I sort of felt foolish at that point because the legend I was going to tell just couldn't be true. But I was backed in a corner, so I had to tell them. Well, see, they believe that this great mountain lion named Mishipishu lives under the lake. They believe he causes swift, violent storms on the lake with the flipping back and forth of his huge tail. And at that, Bernie began to laugh very hard, and I expected that. Right, a big old cat under the water. Maybe a big old catfish, Joey. You'll believe just about anything, won't you? Dad saw my predicament and came to my rescue. He said, "Who's to say what lives down there, Bernie? It could be a spirit they believe in. They have spirits for just about everything. There could be a great spirit living in these waters." "Aw, Dad," Bernie said, "he's got you hornswoggled into believing that stuff too. There ain't no such thing as spirits and all that. But Joey, if you want to believe in fairy tales, then you just go right ahead. Giant mountain lion. Next you'll still be telling us you believe in a Easter bunny and Santa Claus," he muttered half under his breath. But there was something weird about that thunder, and it kept up, and the sky just stayed as blue as a robin's egg. Dad looked kind of uneasy about it, and I could tell even Bernie, though he always tried to act brave, was bothered too. Yes, that thunder gave an otherwise perfect day a really strange feeling. It was about 5 in the afternoon when we reached Big Charity Island and put in there. No one lived on the island, and Dad told us that the only people who visited there were hunters and some Indians that held special ceremonies and feasts there. I was kind of nervous about those Indians. I'd never been around any, save a few that came into the store once in a while. I was told they could get pretty ornery if they got to drinking. A friend of mine in school said they even sacrificed people to their spirit gods, cut their hearts right out while they were still beaten, he said. I couldn't ask Dad and Bernie about that. Bernie would have a lot of fun with it for sure. Dad and Bernie anchored the boat and brought down the sails. We walked through the shallow water to the shore, each of us carrying supplies on our backs. I was a little scared, I have to say, but also excited about our first night out on this beautiful island covered with thick stands of pine trees. Chapter 2. A Dire Warning. We picked a spot just off the beach to set our tent, a place where we had a clear view of the sailboat. Dad and Bernie took charge of putting up the tent. I picked up rocks from the beach to make a hearth where we would build our campfire. It wasn't hard to find rocks because there was a little sand on the beach, mostly stones, and all the while we busied ourselves that thunder just kept getting real loud. Gathering the rocks was something I really liked because there were some interesting fossils. I gathered up some of them and took them back to camp for Dad and Bernie to take a look at. Dad seemed to know a lot about everything. He was a real smart man. Grandpa and Grandma always kind of felt that he wasted his time with the store being that he had been to college and all. But Dad seemed happy with what he did. Anyways, Dad picked out one stone that was as black as a starless night. It had the impression on it of what looked like a little bug. "What do you think it is, Dad?" I asked. "I saw a bigger one in a museum once. You see, this here little critter they say lived in the great oceans that covered Michigan long before there were even any people around. It's called a trilobite," he said. Bernie examined it and then came up with a good idea, something that was kind of sparse on his part. He said, "I think we should take it with us. Do these little things still live around here?" "No," Dad answered. "They all have died out." Among the other fossils I brought to the camp were different kinds of coral and one small fish. Bernie and I decided we would collect all the unusual things we could find on the trip and then take them home with us, kind of like a record of the things we had seen, and it sounded fun. By the time we had the tent all ready for the night and our fire going, we were all pretty tired and hungry. Our supper was beans and ham. Mama was a good cook to be sure, but I never tasted anything in all my days as good as those beans and ham cooked over that fire. Guess there's just something real special about cooking outdoors. The thunder was keeping up as the sun was sinking low in the sky, but then there was something new to worry about. From somewhere on the island came the beat of drums. There was Indians about, and that made me real edgy. Bernie, too. Dad could tell we were nervous, even more so than a mama coon with brand new babies trotting along beside her. He tried to calm us by saying, "There's no reason to be concerned. These Chippewas are all a friendly lot. They'll likely see our fire. Some might even pay us a visit. But don't be scared. They are just people like us three. They just dress a little different and believe in things a little differently than us." As we sat around the fire, Dad sipped his coffee, and I said, "I wonder what Mama and Tesha are doing tonight." "Probably at church right about now," Bernie answered, "and likely praying for us if I know your mother, and I do," Dad added. It was dark, and I was sure we'd see lightning by this time, but none yet. There was a high ridge about 200 yards from our camp, and us three climbed it to see what we could see. A ways off, we spotted the glow of the Indians' campfire. It seemed a safe distance to me. The drums were still pounding, but I didn't feel so bothered. The woods was full of all kinds of sounds that were a little scary and pretty at the same time. The hoot owl was a sound I knew well, and the crickets and frogs, but out here, away from home, they sounded different somehow. Dad looked at his pocket watch and said, "Well, boys, it's 8:30, and we got lots to do tomorrow. I want to make it to Tawas Bay. We'll probably camp there tomorrow night. It's time we were getting to sleep." Bernie stoked up the fire, and then we got into the tent. We didn't need no blankets. It was still plenty warm. Dad laid down, then Bernie and me. I got in the middle, and I was all right because I felt safer there. I knew no matter what happened, I was safe between my dad and my older brother, so I closed my eyes, and I quickly fell asleep. But that sleep didn't last long, because about 10 o'clock, we three were woke up by something knocking over our coffee pot. Dad sat bolt up, and Barney wiped the sleep from his eyes. "What was that?" I asked. "Shh," Dad said, holding a finger to his mouth. Bernie said, "Probably just a coon or a possum." "No, I don't think so," Dad said. Then he shouted, "Who's out there?" There was a moment of silence, and then a dry old voice said, "I am Chief Tamaqua. I have come to warn you." Dad opened the tent, and the three of us got out. Our fire was still burning, casting dancing flickers over everything. There before us was what I was sure was the oldest man I'd ever seen, maybe the oldest man alive by the way he looked. His face was so wrinkled, the wrinkles were deep like canyons all over his face, and his long hair was straggled and white, whiter than snow. He stood before us in clothes that must have been made from deer hides, and Dad asked, "What do you mean you've come to warn us? Warn us about what?" "Listen," the old chief ordered. "Do you hear the thunder? The dry thunder with no clouds or rain?" "Yeah, we hear it," Dad replied. "It's an omen of things to come. The lake is about to have a special visit from the mighty Manitous of old." "Manitous?" Bernie questioned. "Yes, Bernie, they are spirits, great and powerful spirits," Dad said. The old man's eyes were filled with awe. Even the great Creator Spirit himself might visit these waters soon, visit the great turtle which used to be his home before the white man came. "Well, I remember that," I exclaimed. "The great turtle is Mackinac Island. The Indians used to believe that Gitche Manito lived there." And Dad asked, "So again, why are you warning us?" "The spirits are sad that these waters and lands are no longer ours. You must stay off the waters, for very strange things will happen as the Manitus come." And then the old chief looked at us boys and said, "Take them back where you come from, so they will be safe." "No, I can't do that. We're on a special adventure, and I'm not going to let a little thunder stop us," Dad replied. The chief reached into his pocket and pulled out a stone disc, which looked to me to be about the size of a silver dollar. He held the disc out to Dad. "Then take this gift I give you. It'll protect you should you fall into danger on this trip, but you can only use it once." Dad took the stone disc and held it down where we could both see it. Etched into it was the image of a thunderbird. I recognized it because of all the reading I had done about the Indians. "Anamiki!" I exclaimed. The chief smiled, revealing a mouthful of blackened teeth. "Yes, young one, he is very powerful and good and will protect you. When he does, at that time of your choosing, he will take the disc from you. Use it with wisdom." Dad thanked the chief, and the old man added, "Is there nothing I can say to make you return home?" "No," Dad replied, "but thank you for this gift." The chief turned and left, and after a short while we went back into the tent and fell asleep again, though the second time wasn't as easy as the first. I didn't sleep well at all, and had weird dreams about that old chief and the spirits that he talked about. In one dream, we had started out the next morning, got a fair distance from the island, when giant waves came up out of the water from nowhere. I looked over the side of the boat, and I could see the huge tail of the black mountain lion, and then its face with huge sharp teeth and bolts of fire shooting out of its mouth. And in another dream I saw my dad and brother tied to some kind of stone altar. The chief we had met stood before them with a huge stone knife raised way up in the air like he was going to stab it into Dad. That dream must have scared me real bad, because I woke up in a cold sweat trying to catch my breath. I was sure relieved to see Dad and Bernie laying right there sound asleep. I poked my head out of the tent, and there was just a hint of light to the east over Lake Huron. Soon the sun would rise, and we could begin our journey on north to Tawas Bay. I figured I'd surprise Dad and Bernie and get breakfast started. I went out and stirred up the embers of our campfire and added some dry wood to it. Soon there was a real good fire going, so I got the coffee pot on first. That should get those two late risers out of bed, I thought to myself. Next I got some eggs frying and ham heating up, and it wasn't long before Bernie poked his ugly head out of the tent. "You look awful," I said. "Looks like a pack rat tried to make a nest in your hair." Bernie rubbed his eyes and said, You ain't that all-fired pretty yourself, but since you got breakfast ready, I guess you're pretty enough. Aw, I ain't pretty at all, you son of an old rattler. I didn't take too kindly to being called pretty, but it was good looking, and I wouldn't argue that point one lick. Yeah, I was good looking. I remember Julie Martin telling me one day how cute she thought I was. Now, Julie, there was a pretty gal. I wouldn't mind too much if she kissed me, but I wouldn't ever tell anyone that. Soon Dad stuck his head out of the tent and, kind of groggy-like, said, "One of you boys have my coffee?" And then he yawned, big enough to stick the whole pot in. "Dad," Joey called you an old rattlesnake. I did not, I shot back. It was just... But Dad cut me off. "Don't care to hear about it right now," Dad said. "Till I've had my coffee, I'm ornery enough to be an old rattler. Now give me my coffee, or I'll rattle my tail and bite you both." And at that, Bernie and I both had a good laugh, and we gave him his morning brew, good and strong. I have to say breakfast was just as good as supper. I ate and then went over to an old pine tree that looked like it needed some watering and did my morning duty. Bernie picked another tree and Dad still another. And after that, with the sun well up from its nightly rest, we decided to take a stroll on the beach. Bernie exclaimed, "Hey, you guys, listen." "Listen to what, Bernie? You hearing voices?" I asked. "No, you idiot." Dad gave a disapproving glance for that. "The thunder. It's gone." Dad smiled. "Well, I'll be darned. So it is. I hadn't even noticed. Guess maybe that old chief didn't quite know what he was talking about." I pointed north over the lake. But look at all that fog out there, and it sort of looks sparkly, kind of like that glitter stuff Tesha uses sometimes when she makes birthday cards. "Yeah, Dad, look at it," Bernie said. "That's weird. Just as weird as the thunder was." Dad agreed. "Well, I've never seen fog like that before. It's kind of greenish, too. Anyways, it's warm and the sun is out, and it'll burn off in an hour or so. Why don't we go back, break up camp, and then we can get on our way? Maybe we should sit tight here until the fog lifts. After all, we got plenty of time for the trip." Sure as hang, Bernie and me actually agreed on something again. I can count on one hand how many times that ever happened. Dad stared out at the fog and then at us boys. We could tell by the look on his face he wasn't sure what to do. But Dad wasn't one to scare easily. "No, we'll give it a little bit and then start out. There isn't anything going to hurt us." Didn't matter if Dad thought we were in danger or not. I did, and so did Bernie. But then that fog got stranger still because it started moving towards the island instead of just burning off like Dad thought it would. And the closer it got to us, we could hear sounds coming from it. "What do you suppose that racket is anyways?" I asked. "Sounds like Indians singing. There must be a canoe traveling through the fog," Dad guessed, and we knew it was just a guess. For me, well, I was pretty sure it was what old Chief Tamaqua had warned us about. There were spirits in that fog, and I was sure not looking forward to meeting up with them. The fog got just about to the island, and then real dark clouds blocked out the sun. The abominable thunder began again, but it was coming from both the clouds and the fog. And that singing got really loud. I don't mind saying I had shivers going up and down my backbone. The air was so hot, and still the thunder just rolled without a break. "Well, I think we better get into the tent until this passes," Dad ordered us, and then hustled us down the trail. As we was making our way back, a bolt of bright blue lightning streaked down from the sky and sounded like a cannon going off, struck and exploded a big old pine tree into a million bitty little pieces, and just leaving the smoldering stump. Then the clouds seemed to open up, and it looked like a fiery wood stove inside. Dad rushed us along, and it began to rain, but it weren't no ordinary rain. The stuff was gray, the color of wood ash, and it left suds on the ground as it fell. It sort of stung when it touched our skin. We three ducked inside the tent as the lightning flashed and the thunder rolled. It got as black as night outside. That gray rain, it just kept on a-falling. Don't think I wasn't plenty scared, 'cause I was. I was scared enough to be shaken like I was chilled to the bone, but I wasn't. It was too hot for that. "Joey, stop it," Dad said to me. "There's nothing to be afraid of." But even Bernie was upset by that rain, and I thought I saw him give a shiver or two himself. And I said, "Maybe that old Indian was right, Dad. Maybe we should turn around and go back home." Dad scowled at that. "That's not going to happen. I'm surprised that either one of you would even think of that. We aren't going to let a little storm scare us into going back." "Little storm!" I exclaimed. "What about that gray rain out there? Can you tell me why that's happening?" I just knew he wouldn't have an explanation for that. "Well, maybe I can. Maybe there's a forest fire somewhere, and the wind and rain picked up the ashes and they're dumping them here." Bernie slapped his forehead. "You know, you could be right, Dad. I wasn't ready to give in so easy, but after an hour or so the rain stopped, the fog lifted, and the sun came back out. I was never so happy in my entire life to see that big bright old sun. We three broke camp and got back into the boat so that we could continue our northward journey to Tawas Bay. But I still could not get out of my mind the sound of the Indians singing from that fog. We never did see a canoe. I wanted to ask Dad about that, but I thought it was better not to. He was still in a bad mood about the time we had lost waiting out the storm. Bernie and I sat on the foredeck. We both had taken off our shirts to soak up as much of that sun as we could, and we had fishing poles over the side. "Oh, Joey, I picked up some pieces of that splintered pine tree to put in our collection of stuff from the trip," Bernie said. "Great, not many people have something like that." And then I added, "And don't tell Dad, but I emptied out that bottle of Raleigh's pain cure and gathered some of that gray rain, too." And then I corked it back up. "Good idea. I'd never thought to collect any of that." "Boy, I just hope nothing else strange happens on this trip," I said. And while we sat there talking and fishing, Bernie and me caught 21 perch. I hated cleaning fish, but Bernie and I scaled them, gutted them, and wrapped them up so we could fry them for supper later. "You know," I said to my brother, "those things are pretty ugly on the inside. Kind of makes me feel a little sick to think of eating them." "Well, then don't think about it, Joey. Just enjoy how good the fresh fish taste. I'm sure going to." Chapter 3. Night of the Pukwudgies. That afternoon as we was sailing north, we saw another boat going south, and the two men in it hailed to us. We came alongside them to see what they wanted. Now these two men looked pretty rough, and I had a sure good idea that they were lumberjacks headed south to find summer work. But they sure was all excited about something. "Where are you all coming from?" one of the bearded men asked Dad. "We started from Harbor Point, spent last night on Big Charity Island with my boys here. Where are you two headed?" "Well, we're heading down to Saginaw to look for work. Say, did you guys have kind of a unusual storm down this way this morning?" "Yeah," Dad answered. "Did you have it up here too?" "Lordy, but we sure did," the other man answered. "Scared the heck out of most of the folks up that way. Never saw anything like it. They're all scared yet up at Tawas. The Indians have them stirred up. Some nonsense about the lakes being visited by some old spirits. Hogwash." "Well, there could be something to it," Dad said. Well, we have a ways to be going, and we've lost time this morning because of the storm, and I want to be at Tawas Bay in an hour or so good sailing, guys." The men pushed off, and we continued on our way. We put into Tawas Bay about 6 o'clock, and we set camp up on a point of land that juts out into the north end of the bay. It weren't long before Dad and Bernie had the tent back up, and I had the hearth made and a good fire going. Dad started frying those fish that we had caught earlier, and oh my, they smelled real good. He also cut up some potatoes and started them a-frying too. I just hoped all those good smells wouldn't bring some wild animals into our camp. I didn't have to just worry about the Indians and their spirits now. I also had to worry about bears. I was told there was plenty of them in the north. Dad served the fish and potatoes and then led us in a prayer of thanks. Of course we remembered Mama and Tesha back home, and I'm sure they remembered us many times a day. I wondered if they had the storm too, and how scared they must have been if they had. I decided after supper I'd get out some paper and pencil and write them a letter. Someplace along the way I'd probably be able to send it out to them. We just finished eating when an old-timer stumbled into our camp. As old as he looked, still he seemed like a boy compared to Chief Tamaqua. He sounded a bit angry at first. "What are you fellas doing out here? It's dry. You could start a fire." Dad stayed calm. "Oh, we're being careful. My name's Hudson Ranger, and these are my boys, Bernie and Joey. We are sailing on up to Sault Ste. Marie. This is our second night out, and we decided to camp here on the point." He pointed his old finger at Dad, and he said, "Well, I guess there ain't no harm in that. You just watch that fire, though." Bernie asked, "Are there many bears in this part?" "Sure is," the old-timer answered, "but there's more to look out for than bears just now." "What are you talking about?" Dad asked. "The spirits are restless. I've seen them in these woods here. Be wary of them. Be very wary." Well, again I felt that cold wave go up and down my spine and little goosebumps all over my body. Suddenly an old bear didn't seem all that unfriendly. In fact, an old bear would seem like a good neighbor compared to those spirits we'd been hearing about, and I don't mind saying I'd heard enough about them. "Got a spare cup of coffee?" the old man asked. Dad said, by the way, what is your name?" Oh, sorry, I forgot to tell you. I'm Gabe Collins. I moved out here from Maine a few years back. The way things were going this summer, I'm tempted to move back. Well, Joey, get Gabe a cup of coffee. What you have to watch out for here, Mr. Collins told us, are the Pukwudgies. They are the little men of the forest. They are spirits, and they have a lot of magical powers. They aren't so much mean as they are cantankerous. They'll do whatever they can to upset things. You just have to stand up to them and let them see that you're brave. Well, I doubt that we'll be seeing any of those little men, Gabe, Dad said. And with that, the old man downed his steaming cup of coffee and left us in our camp. I gave a sort of chuckle, and Bernie asked what was so funny. Well, he was, I replied. If it weren't for all that strange stuff that's happening, I'd say maybe he'd been drinking spirits before he saw those little men of the woods. We all three had a laugh at that. Maybe he was, Dad said, and then added, now in the morning, I want for us to take a bath. Remember, cleanliness is next to godliness. We'll go out in the bay, have a swim, and bathe at the same time. Now, the swim part of that sounded pretty good, but the bay water felt kind of cold to me when I got off the boat. Still, if that's what Dad wanted to do, then I was game. Then Dad continued to explain. Tomorrow we'll put in at Oscoda. That's only about an hour away. We'll get a few more supplies there, then we'll head for Sturgeon Point Lighthouse. We'll probably spend the night by the Coast Guard station there. Now that sounded like fun. I'd never seen a lighthouse before, and I'll bet the men that worked there had some really good stories to tell about their life-saving missions on the lake. I was tired, but not quite ready for bed, and I asked Dad if he cared if I went down to the beach for a spell and wrote a letter to Mama and Tasha. He said it was okay, so I got out my paper and pencil and went down there and sat on a big old rock. The full moon was bright enough for me to write by. I wrote my letter and then laid back on the warm sand. The waves sounded nice, almost like music. I couldn't believe all the stars that were shining down. It looked like a huge quilt that God sewed up and laid across the heavens to keep all his creation warm and safe. I wondered about God a lot. He must be pretty big, and so wonderful to make all the things he did. I sort of felt sorry for the Indian not believing in him and believing in all those spirits, but then a thought hit me that never had before. What if Gitchimanidu, their creator spirit, well, what if him and God was the same? Maybe that's how he made himself known to them. I sort of liked that idea, and it made me feel a little less nervous because if that was the case, he'd never do anything to harm us. If that was the case, I would have to ask Dad about that later. Just then I thought I heard tiny laughter coming from the woods behind me. I turned and looked, but there weren't nothing there. I stuck my finger in my ears to clean them out and then laid back down. And only a moment later I heard the same laughing again. It sounded kind of like little kids, but not quite. There was something different about it. I was getting used to having chills running up and down my back by that time, and darn, but there they were again. I got up kind of slow, like, and made my way back to camp. Dad and Bernie were just sitting there talking about the trip and what we might do along the way. I didn't say a word about the laughing because I knew there would be more. Bernie laughing at me because he'd make fun for sure. Instead, I just sat there, sort of quiet, looking over towards the woods. I saw a stirring behind a bush. I saw two beady little eyes staring out at us. But they weren't no animal eyes. No, sir, they looked like people eyes, except they was real small. Darn it, why'd that old man have to talk about them little men of the woods, because I was sure that's what I was seeing. But I wondered if I'd be seeing them if he hadn't told us about them. Anyways, they was there, and that's all there was to it. I nudged Bernie in the side with my elbow. Hey, what'd you do that for, runt? Without pointing, I said, look over there by that bush. Tell me what you see. But as soon as Bernie and Dad looked over there, the eyes was gone. I see a bush, Joey. Are you having some problems with your head, little brother? I rubbed my eyes, but sure enough, they was gone. No, I just thought I saw an animal over there. Probably nothing. Well, I think I'm going to go in the tent and lay down. Well, we'll be in shortly, Dad said as he and Bernie continued their discussion. In the tent, I quickly got under my blanket and covered my head. It wasn't so much that I needed a blanket, because it was still plenty warm. No, I was just a mite bit nervous about that laughter and those little eyes. I hoped I could fall asleep fast and forget about them, but that wasn't about to happen. I felt the blanket rise off my feet, and then something tickling my feet that felt like a feather. I couldn't help busting out laughing, and before I knew what I was doing, I shouted out, "Now quit that, it tickles." "What in tarnation is going on in there?" Dad yelled. "Have you lost your mind, boy?" I thought real quick. I was a lot better at that than Bernie ever was. No, sir, I must have been dreaming. I felt like something was tickling my feet. But I knew it wasn't no dream I'd been having. Those little fellas old Gabe Collins had told us about were responsible. Told you he wasn't going to be too stable in the head when he was born, Dad. We could send him back to Mom and Tesh on a train so they could watch out for him. Shut up, Bernie, I hollered out. I ain't going back. And with that I laid there, still, again with the blankets wrapped around my feet so they couldn't get lifted up this time. Then I closed my eyes tight, said my prayers, and tried like all get out to fall asleep, but it just wouldn't happen. Dad and Bernie thought I was sleeping when they got in the tent. It was the same as the night before. I was in the middle, and that was okay by me. I laid there for what seemed a long time, and then Dad began snoring. And then Bernie began snoring. And with all that racket going on, I wondered how I would ever get any sleep. I tried plugging my ears with my fingers, but it didn't help because every time I started falling asleep, my fingers fell out of my ears and there was that loud noise again. I heard clanking around outside and figured there was maybe a little coon out there. Since I couldn't sleep, I stuck my head out of the tent and I could not believe what I was seeing. I rubbed my eyes and then opened them, but sure as all get out, that crazy vision was still there in front of me. Sitting around the campfire, drinking the rest of Dad's coffee, were 3 crazy-looking little men. These had to be the ones Gabe told us about. One of them smiled at me, revealing a mouthful of pointy little teeth. I'd sure hate to get bitten by one of those little guys. He rose his hand and motioned for me to come out, and I shook my head no, but trying to be friendly, I returned the smile. The little guys had their faces all painted up in bright colors, and each had a feather in his hair. They sure didn't wear many clothes, just a small piece of cloth covering up their private area. Shoot, even their little butts was hanging out the back. One spoke to me in a deep but small voice. Come out here. We won't hurt you. We just want to talk. We don't get to talk to white kids very often. Then I got to thinking, what could it hurt to go out and talk to them? Maybe they could tell me some about all the strange things that had been happening. So I got up slowly, trying not to wake up Dad and Bernie, but the way they were snoring, nothing short of a stick of dynamite would get their carcasses up. All right, I said, standing in front of the tent. If you want to talk, why don't you tell me about all this spirit stuff? They all started laughing at me, and then one said, you already know. Our brother, Chief Tamaqua, told you. And another chitted in, yeah, he told you. Then the third one got up and walked towards me. Now what are you doing? You just keep back where you're at. I'm not going to hurt you, so just keep your pants on. And for some reason they all laughed at that. I just want to feel the cloth that your pants are made of. I've never seen anything like it before. Blue is my favorite color. He came up and began feeling the cloth. I curled up my nose because the little fellow smelled something fierce. Gee whiz, don't you guys believe in soap and water? I asked. Again they all chuckled at me, and the one who was drinking the coffee said, we smell all right. We smell all right. It's you that stinks. We smell like Gitchimini wants us to. This is the way he made us, but you white people try to wash away the scent that he gave. Wow, I'm glad we do, I replied. I guess they didn't take too kindly to my kidding them about their smell, because the one that had been touching my clothes walked over to the coffee pot and gave it a good hard kick. It went sailing through the air, hit up against an old oak tree, and got a big dent in it. Now that sort of ticked me off. Why'd you do that? I asked the little guy. Because you said we stink. Then they just up and walked off into the woods laughing at me. I sure hated being laughed at. I sat down by the fire and tried to figure out what I was going to tell Dad about that coffee pot. He wasn't going to be happy about it no matter what I said. And as I sat there, I got real sleepy, and before I knew it, I was sound out cold on the log in front of the fire. Like the night before, I was having all sorts of weird dreams, but this time it was all about the little people I'd just met. I was awakened by my dad and Bernie yelling loudly. It was just after sunup, but I couldn't move. I was bound head to foot by some sort of woven cord, and worst of all, my legs were cold. I looked down and my darned pants was gone. I was laying there just in my underwear. Glancing over to the tent, I saw why they were yelling. The ropes had been cut and the darned thing was caved right in on top of them. But they finally fought their way out, and Dad looked around in disbelief. Our cups and frying pan and most of our other stuff was hanging from the tree branches. When they looked at me, Bernie exclaimed, "What in the heck happened to you?" I was just too mad at that moment to say anything except just get me untied and I'll tell you about it as soon as I find my pants. But when I got up, my pants were nowhere to be found. All that was laying there were 3 small pieces of buckskin the Pukwudgies had been wearing over their fronts. There was no other way except to tell Dad and Bernie the truth, and that's just what I did, beginning to end. Dad sat there shaking his head, and Bernie was laughing hard enough to hold his stomach. And me, well, I was sitting there getting madder and madder. Would Bernie be laughing if he had walked up all hog-tied and his pants missing? I don't think so. I sure wouldn't have laughed at him. Well, maybe just a little, but not as hard as he was laughing at me. No, sir. I had certain loyalty to my brother, even if he didn't have none for me. Well, by and by, we packed up the 3 small pieces of buckskin in with the things we had collected so far, and then broke camp. Us 3 carted our belongings down to the beach and sat them down. In all the excitement, Dad had forgotten about the bath. Laying there on the beach, by the way, were my pants, with 3 patches cut out of them for the little men to use in place of the ones they left me. Now, after our swim and bath, when we all got dressed again, we picked up our belongings and headed back to the sailboat. I was glad to be leaving the bay at Tawas behind, and those ugly little guys that I had met. Once the boat was skimming across the waters, Dad said to me, "Son, I can't think of any other explanation for what happened last night than what you've already told me, but it's sure hard to believe, little men of the forest." "Well, I don't believe it," Bernie said. "It's just stupid. There has to be another explanation. Maybe old Gabe Collins came back last night and did it. Maybe Joey just dreamed the rest." Now that really made me angry. It was bad enough to have to suffer the indignation of having my pants stolen and cut up, but being called a liar, well, those was fighting words. I stood up on the deck and raised my fist. "Come on and stand up and fight. I ain't no liar, and you ain't going to call me one." "Aw, Joey," Bernie said, "I was just teasing. But it does sound like a tall tale. Now just sit back down here and stop acting so crazy." Now he was calling me crazy. Would the indignation never stop? I was so angry I didn't even want to be around him, so I went below and started fixing the supplies, as they was kind of all over the place from the rocking of the boat on the waves. I declare, when Dad, Bernie, and I began planning this trip in the fall, none of us would ever have imagined that we'd have the times we was having. It was only a couple minutes later that Bernie came below and began helping me straighten things out. While he was piling some boxes, he said, "Hey, Joey, I'm sorry I didn't mean to make you mad. It's just that the story sounded so, well, made up. But if you say it happened, I guess it must have." "Well, thanks, Bernie. I'm glad you believe me, because it really happened just like I said." Bernie and me sat down on one of the bunks, and I began telling him about the little men. It was nice having a visit with him, just him and me. Seemed like Bernie and I never did talk much, and for being brothers, really didn't know that much about each other. Well, we were going to learn a lot about each other on this trip, and that was for sure. To be continued with Chapter 4, More Mysteries Unfold.